We are now in study session 9. Themes and techniques in Michael Anthony's The Year in San Fernando. Introduction. In study session 3, we dwelt on the basic tenets of novella. We concluded that it is a prose fiction longer than a short story, but shorter than a novel. In this study session, we will illustrate the tenets of novella with Michael Anthony's The Year in San Fernando. When you have studied this session, you should be able to write a biography of Michael Anthony. Highlight and assess the thematic preoccupations of Michael Anthony's The Year in San Fernando. Critique the techniques and elements of the novella and describe the nexus between the matter and the manner of the novella. About the author, Michael Anthony. Michael Anthony was born in Mayaro in 1930. He attended Mayaro Roman Catholic School and from 1941 to 1942 spent a year at a school in San Fernando. This turned out to be the inspiration for his novel, The Year in San Fernando. By 1944, young Anthony won a bursary to attend the San Fernando Technical School. 2 years after, he began an internship at Trinidad Leaseholds Limited, also known as Texaco. He trained as a molder and worked in the iron foundry until he left for England. Anthony wrote some light verses for the Trinidad Guardian. He also wrote stories for the Barbadian literary magazine BIM. In 1954, he left for England. There, he worked in factories. He also found time for his literary pursuits, contributing to Caribbean Voices, a literary feature of BBC's Calling the Caribbean. Unfortunately, Anthony and many other young authors were left stranded when this program was taken off the air. Later, Anthony responded to an advertisement by Hutchinson Publishing Company calling for young writers to submit stories. Publishers advised Michael Anthony to attempt a full-length novel. In 1963, Anthony published The Games Were Coming, which was printed by Andre Deutsch. The Year in San Fernando was published a couple of years after the first novel. At one time, Anthony worked in the United Kingdom and then from 1970 to 1988 in Trinidad and Tobago. He was closely associated with the National Cultural Council, started by the late Prime Minister, Dr. Eric Williams, in 1971 and supervised by the late anthropologist Dr. J.D. Elder. In 1979, Anthony was presented with the Trinidad and Tobago's Hummingbird Gold Medal for his contributions. Thus far, Anthony has over 25 publications, which include short stories, novels, and historical books on Trinidad and Tobago. In 2003, Anthony was conferred an honorary doctorate by the University of the West Indies at St. Augustine for his contribution to literature in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. We now take a look at the critique of The Year in San Fernando. Subject matter and thematic preoccupations. The text, The Year in San Fernando by Michael Anthony, is a novella. This is informed by its volume and content. It is intermediate between the novel and short story. The Year in San Fernando is a semi-autobiographical text containing the personal childhood experiences of Anthony's life. It tells an analytical story of a 12-year-old boy named Francis, who by fate travels to San Fernando from Mayaru to become a servant companion to Mrs. Chandos. His mother laconically initiates the move, but her son, helpless as he is unable to reject the idea, though he tries to decline with the thought that his other siblings have been looking forward to getting such an opportunity so that it may serve as an escape route out of the impoverished condition of the family after the death of their father. Therefore, 12-year-old Francis gets a chance to go for a year to San Fernando to work as a servant companion to old Mrs. Chandler, but he has never seen a town before or been away from the warmth of his family. The novella dwells on the experiences of a young boy who has to take care of an old lady. The old lady's son was involved with two ladies in two different towns. In fact, the story is about Francis' adventures in San Fernando. San Fernando is one of Trinidad's major cities. It is quite hilly and located on the islands of the southwestern coast. The travel is somewhat tedious for the first-timer in the city because he has never left Mayaro for the city in his life. Having reached San Fernando, Remain Street, where Mr. Chando's gigantic, unparalleled imposing building is located, he meets heart-biting surprises as to the reception of the Chandos in San Fernando. He is treated as a second-class citizen at San Fernando to the degree that he never ceases thinking about his village communalistic life, which is converse to the city life in San Fernando. During his stay, his mother takes pains to see the well-being of her transplanted son in San Fernando as a result of the letter he sends. She is warmly received by Mrs. Chandos, but the situation of her son displeases her. Even she bursts into tears as she cannot hold her emotion. The young boy grows with the different experiences he is exposed to in San Fernando. There, he responds to pressure of madness in man as he is entangled in love with Julia, an older lady. He acquires marketing skills as he is tutored by Prinetta before she leaves. He has a raw deal with the hidden life of the Chandos, which the outside world is not familiar with, especially his own biological mother. He is exposed to different seasons in San Fernando. He learns much about what his teacher at village has taught him about Mountain Naparaima, climatic situation of San Fernando, various people that market their goods in their market, and the like. Francis' family is stuck in poverty in the village of Mayaro, while the Chandos family exudes opulence and wealth in every sense of the word, for Mr. Chandos wallows in an aura of aristocracy. Francis' mother is merely a poor office worker whose meager pay hardly sustains a family of 4 children. It is in a bid to strive to better the lot of his family that the poor Francis moves over to the town of San Fernando, but ironically, he could not cope with the atmosphere of aristocracy and extreme wealth that he sees himself in. This is partly due to the problem of social stratification in the society. Despite so much wealth, tension and tug-of-war reign supreme in the entire household of the Chandos. Mrs. Chandos and her 2 children, Edwin and Chandos, are always at loggerheads. The whole scenario makes Francis sick, and he concludes that no such thing will happen in his own family despite his poor background. Therefore, in spite of the opulence and refinement of the Chandos, they have no peace of mind. One had expected that wealth would bring in peace, but rather dissatisfaction, war of attrition, and disunity become the order of the day, especially on weekends when Mr. Chandos comes back from the forestry office. Wealth is not peace. Essentially, The novel mirrors the contrast in the lives of the two families, one poor and the other rich. All that glitters is not gold. Let us now take a look at techniques. There are various techniques that the author employs to make his narrative real to the readers. The techniques include the following: the use of minute details or vividness. The author, Michael Anthony, makes use of this method of narration in which he paints with clarity all incidents in the novella. Far from displaying a lack of form, the novella is remarkable for a nearly classical observance of the unities. One action, one place, and one time. Francis' physical world is clearly defined. The Chandos' house placed at a particular distance from the house, and persons and objects seen on journeys to and from the house. Within this physical framed world, Francis' behavior is given pattern by a number of routines, in which the same way as social conventions do in real life: going to the market, sweeping the house, watering the plants, and rubbing Mrs. Chandos' legs with sakru, the Indian sacred oil, or looking at the growing cane and the cane fire in the distant fields. For instance, the author paints the vivid picture of the tall building in San Fernando. Now the tall, strange building towered high above the streets, and under their overhanging verandas, the pavements teemed with people. The power of description of the author is dexterously displayed in the text as it paints the magnificence of Mr. Chandos' building, the falling of rain alternating with the sun, and so much more. The use of stream of consciousness. The author oftentimes reveals a psychological makeup in guise of Francis in the text. Francis' psychological posture is rarely monitored through the use of stream of consciousness. Francis will plunge into reminiscences of the past events in such a fashion that narration is rendered in his explanation of the events in the text. For example, and now slowly, my thoughts shifted to the big house in San Fernando. I wished I had some idea of what it looked like. The narrator, Francis, usually travels in the space of his memory throughout the novella. The memory of riverside experience or excitement with his village peers lingers, and he remembers the dexterity of Balgobin in swimming and his swimming skill in the water. Many more thoughts make roots in Francis' mind as a result of his experience. The experience he has makes his psychological posture to suffer, and this subsequently provokes various thoughts in him, and by this he intimates his readers with the goings-on in his inner self. The text, The Year in San Fernando, is more of psychology than history, in the sense that the author aptly educates the readers about the effects of harrowing experiences on man's personality. It is obvious in the text that what Francis goes through shapes his attitude and thinking about life, and consequently, it will affect his personality in his future life, as stipulated by Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic and psychosexual theory. More is known about Francis through the author's searchlight on Francis' psyche. Francis reminisces and imagines most time, and the author usually fixes up his readers by informing his narrator's psychology. We're now in the use of symbols. The author cleverly employs the use of symbols in his work. That is, there are incidents that stand to depict something different in the mind of the reader. These are analyzed below. 1. The fracas that erupts on Easter Thursday between Mr. Chandos and Mrs. Chandos seems to be symbolic. From Holy Thursday, Francis, like Jesus Christ, suffers his passion, but on Easter Day, the day of Christ's resurrection, there is general happiness. 2. Mrs. Princett's visit to Isabeau. She is a pleasure woman with humane touch. Her comportment is a contrast to Mrs. Chandos, whose behavior she modifies all through her stay in the big house. Arrival into the Chandos house brings a sort of unusual relief to Francis, who is seen as a second-class citizen in the family. 3. The cat and dove bird's tangle in the passage is symbolic. Life must be taken carefully in order not to lose one's life or advantage of another. 4. Throughout the text, the rains are the symbol of life, while the dry season symbolizes aridity and death. Water symbolizes strength and freshness, whereas dryness portends destruction and hopelessness. This is evident in Mrs. Chandos' situation in the text. She feels all right with advent of rains, but loses brightness and vitality when dry season appears. 5. The manner by which rains fell and stopped is a symbol of the incessant quarrel between Mrs. Chandos and her son. At the moment when there are no big quarrels in the house in any way, it does not, however, suggest that the struggle for the house is over. 6. The luxuriance of the sweet broom weed is symbolic of evil, which easily sprouts, whether or not it is catered for. Goodness, like previous flowers, do not flourish easily. 7. The alteration between rain and dryness seems to be a reflection of disagreement and harmony in Chandos' house. According to the narrator, usually the sky had been overcast and there had always been the feeling that the bright spell would not last, and indeed it hadn't. And finally, 8. The never-drying sweet broom weed, which pushes up so high again and again among the flowers, is a symbol of the never-ending misunderstanding in Chandos' house, where there are both beauty and wealth. Story within a story. The author exposes Francis' fantasy by his daydreams as the subconscious mind repaints in his dreams the journey back home with his idealized lover, Julia, who charges him not to entertain love game but to face his studies squarely. He plunges into another form of fantasy as he finds himself being winged out from the coffin carrying Mrs. Chandos' lifeless body. His last terminus of fantasy gives him a peal of guilt as conscience pricks him of Edwin's $1 which he fails to return. His conscience seems to have convicted him over the matter, which is why everybody seems to be running to hold him. We now take a look at the use of irony. There is a great irony used when Francis admits he doesn't like Martha, whereas her husband-to-be, Mr. Chandos, informs him that you two, that is Martha and Francis, should do well. Another use of irony is that it seems to be ironic that San Fernando, which Ma thinks will be fair haven for her son, turns a land of slavery. This is like biblical Jacob and his children when they migrate to Egypt with dancing and mirth, not knowing that the land will later turn into their land of suffering and bitter slavery. This is the experience to share, one believes, when Francis reaches home. Another use of irony is that it is an irony of life to Francis himself to have witnessed constant domestic fields in Chandos' house, which makes him to have a reminiscence of his family at the village, which lacks the luxury of the Chandos' house, but where family members still live in harmony and love. It is metaphorically ironic that one man's sauce is another man's poison. dry season that brings relief to Ma in the village heralds trouble for Mrs. Chandos in the city. Let us now take a look at four characters. Mrs. Chandos and Ma are 2 worlds apart. Ma can relate well with her children, but Mrs. Chandos cannot. Mrs. Princett's disposition about life is different from Mrs. Chandos. The latter's and former's relationship with Francis contrast them with each other. Mr. Chandos and Edwin are 2 different entities. The former is portrayed as aggressive and insolent to his mother, while the latter makes a good relationship with his mother. Mr. Soames is stern, but Mr. Langley is a teacher who encourages his pupils. The use of contrast. The author contrasts the following: Francis and the Chandos, Mayaro and San Fernando, Francis family and the Chandos, rainy season and dry season, and planting season and harvest season. What is style? The use of style. Point of view. The story in The Year in San Fernando is presented in a first-person narrative style. This means the author uses one of the characters, in this case Francis, to tell the story. The novel is crafted with poetic prose. Again, simplicity of language runs through all the pages. This makes it easy for an average reader to comprehend the story without much hassle. Take this for example. I wish I had some idea of what it looked like. I wondered it was as fine a building as this forestry office here. This was really a huge great building. Terrific. He smiled with me. Conversely, virtually every dialogue is rendered in a sort of pidgin English. Example, you is a little boy on page 21. You is a man on page 21. Yes, I call you. How you like San Fernando? What sort of work does he do here? The use of kid narrator. Francis is 12 years old when he leaves Mayaro, and he is seen throughout the story as a narrator. The author adopts this with a view to exploring the coming transition of the Caribbean societies in the 1950s, the period of independence, and to reflect the newness of the independence. Francis is a tool to experiment this as he grows or passes from being a child to another stage of development in his passage from Mayaro to San Fernando. It shows the passage of a boy, Francis, from childhood to adolescence. Social realism. The novella relies on the convention of social realism as it is preoccupied with societal problems. This kind of prose fiction collects its materials from an archival database. Bildungsroman. The novella is a Bildungsroman, that is, a text of education. It depicts the growth of Francis from childhood to adolescence, from passivity to activity, from innocence to knowledge, immaturity to maturity, from sexual passivity to sexual alertness. So far, in this study session, we carried out an analysis of Michael Anthony's novella titled The Year in San Fernando. We contextualized the analysis by beginning with a biography of the author. We commented on the thematic preoccupations of the novella, including love, excursion, child abuse, filial conflict, alienation, and the like. We also examined the techniques employed in the novella and its elements. The novella was also critiqued by commenting critically on the nexus between its content and form. We have now come to the end of study session